This is FE Peer Review. The date is December 30th, 2020. This is the post-election analysis of polling. This is a follow-up video to the video I made on the 2nd of November, the evening before the US presidential election. In that earlier video, which you can find on my channel, I summarized the status of a wide variety of polls that have been done in the previous 2 to 4 weeks. I got my data from the website realclearpolitics.com. And then I also touched on a few articles written by a few of the noted pollsters and other people. So this video is a follow-up to that, as promised. In it, we're going to look at the data that was the results that were anticipated on the eve of the 2nd of November, and we're going to look at how it actually ended up. So we will now proceed. First, a brief recap. I had made this chart. It's not the most elegant bit of graphics, but I think it pretty much covers everything we need to look at. I had made this chart and used it in the previous video, and the way it works is across the bottom we have a list of states. These are not all the 50 states, but these were the states that were most watched. And then on the vertical axis we have a 0, where I'm circling my mouse, and then positive numbers above, negative numbers below. And what the numbers indicate are the margin between Biden and Trump according to the poll. So for example, in Florida, we can look at this red dot at the number -1 line, or below the 0, the -1 red dot. That represents a particular poll that showed Trump leading Biden by 1% in Florida. Conversely, there are two polls in Florida that showed Biden leading Trump by 6%. Those are the two blue dots up above. Real Clear Politics used their own algorithm based on their belief in the validity of the various pollsters to come up with their own, I won't call it it's kind of an average, but a weighted average, an average weighted according to their evaluation of the pollster's quality. And that's this little square with the square dot inside. I also added a square without a square dot, which simply represents the numerical average. In the case of Florida, those two numbers were the same. In the case of Pennsylvania, Real Clear Politics weighted the average such that it was actually slightly lower than the straight numerical average, which you see with the blue square above. The same applies to Wisconsin. We see the Real Clear Politics and the straight average there. Anyhow, that was where things were on the 2nd of November, and the blue dots represent Biden leading, and the red dots represent Trump leading. The black dots are a tie. So we will now see the results in each of those states based on what was reported. So how this image works, what I've added are these red arrows and blue arrows. And the red arrow indicates where the final margin between the two candidates ended up. A red arrow means Trump led, and a blue arrow means Biden led. So for example, in Florida, Trump's winning margin over Biden was a little more than 3%. In Pennsylvania, Biden's winning margin was a little more than 1%. We have a little more than 1 in Wisconsin. We have Trump leading by a little more than 1 in North Carolina, so forth and so on through the list. What you will find here, which I'm sure at this point is no surprise to anybody if you've been following the news, is that very consistently these results have been well in favor of Trump compared to where the pollsters expected. So Real Clear Politics, they had Biden leading in Florida at about 1.6%. The final result was Trump leading in Florida by about 3.3%. Yes, as far as graphics, the black line shows you the degree to which the number of points separating the Real Clear Politics average and the final result. So in the case of Florida, we see it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% difference between the anticipated result and the actual result. Pennsylvania, the difference is closer to 2%. Wisconsin, the difference is 2, 4, 5.5%. Now, most of these polls, the best of them have margins of error calculated margins of error that they calculate themselves at about 3.5% plus or minus. That means if they say that it's a dead heat, it's a tie between Biden and Trump with a 3.5% margin of error, that means that theoretically that Biden could win by 3.5% or Trump could win by 3.5%, and the poll would be considered a valid representation of the results. Well, we can see here that we've got 5%, which is well beyond the 3.5% of a good quality poll. We've got about 5% over here, which is well beyond the same. We've got 2, 4, 6.5% in Ohio. We've got 2, 4, 6.5% in Iowa. We've got about 4% in Texas. And then we've got about 3 over here in New Hampshire, 4 in Colorado, and 3 in New Mexico. The others are, the final results were pretty close to the margins of error, pretty close to the final results in terms of margins of error. They almost always favored Trump. Minnesota's an exception. Minnesota voted more Biden than was expected. So what I'm finding is that of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 states that we've got listed here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the 17, or roughly a third, were pretty well outside the margins of error of the better quality polls. Make of that what you will. That's how it ended up. I think that what concerns me is that they were consistently wrong in the same direction. Every single one except Minnesota, they were consistently wrong in the same direction, sometimes extremely wrong. And so I think that suggests that something about the way the polls are structured is fundamentally wrong. If it were sometimes errors favoring Biden, sometimes errors favoring Trump, it would be fine. That would be what's expected. There might be a few cases where it's a little beyond the margin of error because of whatever. But when it always ends up going one direction, I think that there needs to be some serious looking at the real systemic process that's in place. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. Now here's what I've done with this slide. We're going to look at which pollsters were closest to the final results. And I'm not going to go through everything on the list. If you want to pause it and study it in detail, you're welcome to, but I'll walk you through how the slide is organized. For a start, I have a reference up here in the top of the center. I've used 2 and 3 letter abbreviations to represent the names of the various organizations that conducted the polls. We've got Atlanta Journal-Constitution, AJ Albuquerque Journal, BGL, Boston Globe, so forth. And then what I've done is I've taken generally the 3, sometimes 2 polls that were closest to the final result. For example, in Florida, the final result was this red arrow. We had one poll just 0.5% above and a couple more polls just below. They were Rasmussen, Susquehanna, and Trafalgar. Similarly, for Pennsylvania, we had the final result just above 1%. We had a poll at Tide, and we had a couple of polls up above. These were the 3 closest polls. They were also by Rasmussen, Susquehanna, and Trafalgar. In some cases, I've only listed 2 pollsters, and that would be because of the 3 polls, 2 of them happen to be by the same organization. So these 3 polls for Wisconsin, 2 of these were by, I'm not sure which, going from memory, Trafalgar or Susquehanna, but two of them were from one of those organizations and one from the other. That, I think, makes it clear. Take Michigan, I only listed 1 poll, INS. INS is Insider Advantage. So I only listed 1 poll for Michigan as as being accurate because only 1 poll was really reasonably close to the final result. So you can walk across this list and you will see which of the pollsters got it closest. And now we will look at the next slide, which shows which were farthest. All right, this slide is structured the same way, except what we're looking at here is, well, which three pollsters were farthest from the final result. So again, Florida, final result was the red arrow. These three polls at the top at 5 and 6%, they were by EME, that's Emerson, MON, that's Monmouth, and QUI is Quinnipiac. You can do the same if you'd like. You can go across this list of all the polls and you can see which organizations polled worst in terms of the final results. There are a few that we see coming up again and again. Quinnipiac comes up a lot, which I find unfortunate. I used to enjoy studying their polls, but after this, I'm seeing that they're one of the least reliable. Monmouth shows up here and there. CNN, ABC, Washington Post, that's combined, ABC and Washington Post. New York Times Siena is another that shows up a few times too many. So there's a good reference if you want to find out which pollsters got it wrong. As a little reminder, if you want to go back and look at any specific state and the results for that state, I'm not going to recap that in this video, but you can go back to my previous video, the video of November 2nd, where I went through state by state, the polls for every state on the list. This was, for example, a page from Florida, and we have the list of pollsters on the left, and we have the results on the right. If you really need to look up the detail, you can cross-reference between the two videos. The numbers in the chart in the video, in the slide we just looked at, all come from these individual state results, and all of these pages that you see here with this particular type of chart, they all come from Real Clear Politics. This is a chart that appeared on 270 to Win, and it was showing the states color-coded as to safe, likely, leans, or toss-up for each of the two parties. And this particular version of the chart was based on the 2020 consensus, which was 270 to Win's compilation of their various pollsters' opinions. That's 2020 consensus. And what we find here is that Ohio and Iowa were listed among toss-up states, whereas in fact the final results placed Ohio and Iowa well outside the 5% limit that was supposed to be toss-up. So they really ought to have been placed in the leans category. They had a similar chart based on polling, the polling map. And the polls also showed Ohio and Iowa as leans, as toss-up. The polls also indicated Texas as the toss-up state, whereas in fact those three ended up outside the range of what they categorized as toss-up. Similarly, they have 270 to Win had a chart for a map like this for Senate, and one was based on the 2020 consensus, which we see here. They showed Maine as toss-up. It in fact was a toss-up. It went Republican. North Carolina, which also went Republican, was listed as leans and would have more properly been in the category of toss-up. The same applies in this chart, which is the same Senate map, but based on polling rather than expert consensus. North Carolina was shown as toss-up in the polling, whereas the experts saw it as moving towards the Democrats, when in fact it ended up going to the Republicans. This was a page from the New York Times, and it had, on the eve of the election, they had published this little list of figures here with swing states. Arizona ended up going for Biden, although not by the margin that they showed here. Michigan as well. Nevada as well. North Carolina, the numbers were roughly switched. It ended up going for the Republicans. Ohio went for Republicans in a big way. It was nowhere near a tie. Pennsylvania went Democrat, but by quite a narrow margin compared to this figure here. Texas went Republican, a little stronger than these numbers show, but not a lot. And Wisconsin went Democrat quite strongly. This page from the New York Times shows that they anticipated a victory by Cal Cunningham in North Carolina for the Senate seat. They did not get that correct. They did describe Cunningham's lead as slim based on their own Siena New York Times poll. His loss was not large, so within the margin of error of the poll, it may have fit. Nonetheless, it was one more chalk it up to margin of error. This was a page from Quinnipiac, Florida, Ohio, and nationwide. Florida, Biden leading Trump with a margin of 5%. Ohio, Biden leading Trump with a margin of 4%. Both ended up being way off. Cheryl Atkinson, in an article on Real Clear Politics. She is, by the way, a Trump supporter, and she was highly optimistic about Trump's prospects. She wrote a little article to that effect and said that she strongly believed Trump was going to win. This political outsider is predicting another 4 years for Trump, and thanks to factors such as protests, rioting, chaos, etc., he'll rake in a larger popular vote than he did before. Well, he did get more votes than in 2016. Problem was that Biden got yet more still. We had massive turnout in 2020, larger than any election in our history. And though more people voted for Trump than previously, it was due to increased turnout overall, and Biden came out on top. So she's both right and wrong. He'll rake in a larger popular vote than he did before. Unfortunately, it was a minority popular vote. Then again, a political outsider like me couldn't possibly be so wildly off of the prevailing wisdom and be correct twice in a row, right? And yes, absolutely right. You could not be twice. You were not right twice in a row. You were right the first time, 4 years ago, and you're wrong this time, Cheryl Atkinson, for the record. Sabato's crystal ball, he favored Biden. He also favored a Democratic edge in the Senate. Democrats favored to net seats in the House. Neither of those two things happened. Well, the outcome of Georgia election hasn't happened yet, so there's a slim chance, or there's some chance that it might end up being 50-50 in the Senate. However, they did not gain some of the seats that Sabato's crystal ball was anticipating they would gain, and on which basis they thought the Democrats would be in the majority in the Senate. And they also lost seats in the House. So 1 out of 3, Sabato crystal ball got it right 1 out of 3. Here we have some more from Sabato's crystal ball. Electoral College rating. The way they ended up with their ratings on the eve of the election. Florida leans Republican. They got that right. Georgia leans Democratic. They got that right. Iowa, Republican, yeah. Sorry, I don't remember the second seat in Maine. I think it may have gone to Biden. I'd have to check that. North Carolina leans Democratic. They moved it from toss-up to leans Democratic. They should have left it in toss-up. And they made the right call on Ohio. Crystal ball Senate rating changes. Joni Ernst moved from leans Democratic to leans Republican, and she did indeed win. Thom Tillis in North Carolina. The old rating was toss-up. They changed the rating to leans Democratic. Thom Tillis, Republican, ended up winning the seat, so they should have left it in toss-up. Again, Sabato's crystal ball. These two maps show the Electoral College and the Senate, and they're showing North Carolina as leans Democratic. It would have been better off putting it in the toss-up category. They were right about. I'm looking at the Senate map here. That was North Carolina, actually, and the same in the Electoral College map. They showed it as leaning Democratic, whereas they really should have left it in the toss-up category. Strictly speaking, Georgia was a toss-up state as well. It happened to go Democratic, but it was not leaning Democratic. Cook Political Report, Electoral College ratings, they listed Iowa and Ohio in toss-up states, whereas they really should have listed them in lean Republican, because the Trump win in those two states was considerably beyond any definition of toss-up. Texas was borderline, with Trump's margin being a little more than 5%, I think close to 6%. I think that also pushes it to the limit of toss-up, and it would have been perhaps better to have included it in the lean Republican category. Cook Political Report, Senate, they generally got it right. The seats that were listed under toss-up, Maine went Republican, Iowa went Republican, but it was correct to call them toss-up. And here we have 538, Nate Cohn. He was predicting a Biden win, but primarily focusing on the state of Pennsylvania in his discussion of it. According to our forecast, Pennsylvania is the most likely tipping point state. Biden leads Trump there by 5 points in our polling average, but it's not as large a margin as Biden might like. Indeed, it's not. And in fact, Biden ended up winning by just over 1% margin. So in fact, their 5-point polling average was about 4% off from the final results, which again puts their polling average outside of a decent margin of error of 3.5%. So yeah, they called Pennsylvania the right way, and on that basis, it was important in Biden's win. However, their perception of Biden's strength in Pennsylvania was not accurate. That pretty well sums up all the material, and I'm just going to do a quick summary here, which is that what we are seeing is that even the best polls, which claim to have margins of error of 3.5% plus or minus, are not falling within that margin. Many of the polls have larger calculated margins of error of up to 5%. And what I think it's important to note here is that in order to squeeze that margin down, you need to largely increase your sample size, like tenfold. Instead of 1,000 sample size of 1,000 voters, you need a sample size of 10,000 voters. And that takes time, which is always a problem with polling because the information changes fast. And that takes money, which is, of course, a problem for everybody. Budgets. So with elections hinging on voting margins of under 1%, with swing states going one way or the other based on votes of under 1%, even a really good quality poll that does meet its margin of error of 3.5% isn't really providing useful information, because it's not going to tell you where you stand. When the win depends on a 1% margin, a 7% gap, 3.5 up, 3.5 down, it's just simply not that useful as information. I think that if I were a candidate, I would do away with polling as a basis for developing campaign strategy. There's just not enough until the margins of error can be brought down to the 0.5 to 1% range, which means lots of money and lots of large sample sizes. They're just not going to be all that helpful. Okay, that's it. Enough of this. I hope you all found this video useful. There's a lot of material in here. I have left most of it just on the screen and haven't talked about it because this is already long enough. Thanks for stopping by and watching, and please do feel free to leave comments on topic. Thanks. Bye-bye.